Chapter 54 of History of the World War by Francis March and Richard Beamish. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne. Chapter 54 Peace at Last. War came upon the world in August 1914 with a suddenness and an impact that dazed the world. When it seemed, in 1918, that mankind had habituated itself to war and that the bloody struggle would continue until the actual exhaustion and extinction of the nations involved, peace suddenly appeared. The debacle of the Teutonic Alliance was both dramatic and unexpected, except to those who knew how desperate were the conditions in the nations that were battling for autocracy. Bulgaria was the first to crumble, then Turkey fell, and Austria-Hungary deserted Germany. The Kaiser and his military advisers, left alone, appealed to the Allies through President Wilson for an armistice during which peace terms might be negotiated. Prince Maximilian of Baden, a statesman whose liberal ideas were rumored rather than demonstrated, was chosen to open negotiations. President Wilson, acting in concert with the Allies, referred Prince Maximilian to Marshal Foch. While negotiations were pending, a cabled message was received on November 7th to the effect that the armistice had been signed and that all soldiers would cease fighting on 2 o'clock of that afternoon. It was a false report, but it spread with incredible speed throughout the country. Celebrations, which included virtually every American, made the country a gala place for 24 hours. The American people with characteristic good nature laughed at the hoax next day and settled down in patience to await the inevitable declaration of an armistice. The true report arrived about 3 o'clock Eastern Time in the morning of November 11th. Shrieks of whistles, the booming of cannon, and the clangor of bells awoke millions of sleeping persons, many of whom trooped into the streets to mingle their rejoicings with those of their neighbors. For a day there was high carnival in town and country throughout the land. Then the nation settled down to face the imminent problems of reconstruction. One of these had to do with the immediate reduction of governmental expenditures during the approaching year. President Wilson had appealed to the voters to elect a Democratic Congress as an evidence of approval for his administration. The reply was a Republican House of Representatives and a Republican Senate. The Congress that had been in continuous session since America entered the war ended its labors in mid-November. For length, bulk of appropriations for the war, and the number and importance of legislative measures passed, the session was unprecedented. Appropriations passed aggregated $36,298,000,000, making the total for this Congress more than $45 billion, of which $19,412,000,000 was appropriated at the first, an extra, session at which war was declared on Germany. Legislation passed included bills authorizing billions of Liberty bonds, creation of the War Finance Corporation, government control of telegraphs, telephones and cables, executive reorganization of government agencies, and extensions of the Espionage Act and the Army Draft Law by which men between 18 and 45 years of age were required to register. Prohibition and woman suffrage furnished sharp controversies during the session. The wartime dry measure was completed, but after the woman suffrage constitutional amendment resolution had been adopted, January 10th, by the House, it was defeated in the Senate by 2 votes. Every man, woman and child in the belligerent nations owed almost 7 times as much money when peace came as he did at the beginning of the war. Figures of the war's cost to the world compiled by the Federal Reserve Board were summarized in the statement that the approximate public debt per capita had increased from $60 before the war to almost $400 at the end of July 1918. To this was added the cost since July, which is at the highest rate of the entire period. The direct cost of the war was calculated by the board at somewhere between $170 billion and $180 billion, not taking into account the authorization of the debt or the cost of indemnities. 4/5 of the huge burden fell upon the shoulders of the future, only Great Britain and America absorbing a considerable amount by taxation. The total debt of the 7 principal belligerents before the war did not exceed $25 billion. The board contrasted these figures with the total value of the gold and silver extracted from the earth since the beginning of the world, which, it said, hardly exceeded $30 billion. The belligerent nations, therefore, owed about 6 times the amount of all the gold and silver produced in all time. Prices rose to 3 times the average of what they were at the beginning of the war. Great Britain's debt increased almost 10 times over in the period of the war, or from $3,580,000,000 to $32,450,000,000 down to June, 1918. These figures do not include the debts of Australia, Canada, New Zealand and South Africa, British colonies. France's debt was quadrupled by the beginning of 1918, increasing from $6,833,000,000 to $25,410,000,000. Italy's debt rose from $2,929,000,000 to $6,918,000,000. Figures for Russia were brought up only to September 1917, but they showed that at that time she owed $26,287,000,000 compared with $5,234,000,000 at the beginning of the war. The public debt of the United States was calculated to January 1, 1918, in order to be in line with those of other countries, increasing by that date to over $8,000,000,000 from a pre-war figure of $1,25,000,000,000. Since that time $11,500,000,000 have been subscribed to the Liberty loans, thus increasing the national debt amount 16-fold. The most extraordinary increase of all was that of Germany, rising from $1,208,000,000 to $26,332,000,000. Austria owed $2,736,000,000 at the beginning of the war, which was increased by June, 1917 to $11,573,000,000. Hungary increased her debt from $1,392,000,000 to $5,910,000,000 by December, 1917. The neutrals, Denmark, Spain, Holland, Norway, Sweden and Switzerland together owed $2,871,000,000 when war began and increased their debts only to $3,710,000,000. Existing war obligations of the United States at the close of 1918 matured as follows: First Liberty loan, $2 billion, redeemable at the option of the Treasury after 1932 and payable not later than 1947. Second Liberty loan, $3,808,000,000, redeemable after 1927, payable in 1942. Third Liberty loan, $4,176,000,000, redeemable and payable without option in 1928. Fourth Liberty loan, $6,989,047,000, redeemable after 1933, payable in 1938. War savings, $879,300,000, up to November, 1918, payable in 1923. With this program of maturity the Treasury, by exercising its option, could call in the nation's war debt for redemption in installments every 5 years until 1947. Secretary of the Treasury, William Gibbs McAdoo, who was also Director General of Transportation, created a sensation when he resigned both offices in November, 1918, the resignation to take effect January 1, 1919. Coming upon the eve of the peace conference in Paris and the announcement that President Wilson intended to head the American delegates to the conference, the resignation caused widespread surprise. The reasons given by Mr. McAdoo were ill health and a serious depreciation of his private fortune during his incumbency of governmental positions. Following the armistice, steps were immediately taken for the repatriation of a considerable portion of the American forces in France and the return to their homes of the men in American training camps. The Third Army of the United States, commanded by General Dickman, was ordered to the western shore of the Rhine, there to cooperate with the troops of the Allies until the conclusion of peace negotiations. The country was amazed on November 23d when General March announced that the casualties of the American forces, which had been anticipated as being less than 100,000, had in reality exceeded 236,000. Explanation for this lay in the fierce onrush of the American forces during the last month of the war. A forecast that many thousands of American boys would remain in France was given by André Tardieu, General Commissioner for the Franco-American affairs, when addressing the Association of Foreign Correspondents in New York City after the armistice had been signed. M. Tardieu appealed for permission to retain American soldiers in France. He said: "We want first and immediate assistance in the matter of labor. We hope that, during the preparation and carrying out of the transportation of your troops back to America, your technical units as well as other units with their equipment will be able to cooperate in that effort. We soon will have to carry out a colossal work of transportation in view of the supplying of the regions evacuated by the enemy, of the recovering of the railroads in northern and eastern France and in Alsace-Lorraine. We will have to clean the reconquered ground of the ruins accumulated by the German hordes. Your army will help us in this work while our population will restore her cities and villages." Again, in reference, not to all purchases, as a large part of our needs will be supplied outside of the United States, but in reference to those purchases which will be made in America, we are in need of credit in dollars covering about 50% of our total purchases for reconstruction. The assistance of that financial help will bring to everyone in France, government and private enterprise, the courage and faith necessary to apply to peace reconstruction the energy and the spirit of enterprise she has so prominently shown during the war. We will exact from Germany the restitution of each part of the material taken away from us as can be recovered, but, besides that restitution, we must bear in mind that speed is a primary condition in the reconstruction of France, and that America, on account of her immense capacities for production, ought to give us the first help. We need ships, chartered ships as well as ships transferred to our flag. The speedy reconstruction of the country is strictly depending on the revival of our mercantile fleet. The colossal effort put up by the United States in the building of her fleet for war purposes will not be diverted from this sacred end if it, in part, helps France to recover on the seas, for the revival of her forces in peace, the means of transportation which were lost to her on account of the war. In reference to these four items, labor, credit, raw materials, ships, I have explained in detail our needs to your administration, by whose welcome I have been deeply moved. What I told them, what I asked for, I am telling it to you again, because a policy of secrecy does not befit our day. We have lost 2.5 million men. Some are dead, some maimed, some have returned sick and incapacitated from German prisons. Whether they be lost altogether, or whether their working capacity be permanently reduced, they will not participate in this reconstruction. The 15th part of our people is missing at the very time we need all our material and moral forces in order to build up our life again. The younger part, yea, the stronger part of our nation, the flower of France, has died away on the battlefields. Our country has been bereft of its most precious resources. Our war expenses, on the other side, 120 billion francs, are weighed heavily on our shoulders. To pay off this debt there are at hand only such limited resources as invasion has left us. The territories which have been under German occupation for 4 years were the wealthiest part of France. Their areas did not exceed 6% of the whole country. They paid, however, 25% of the sum total of our taxes. These territories, which have been, for the last 3 months, occupied again by us at the cost of our own blood and the blood of our allies, are now in a state of ruin even worse than we had anticipated. Of the cities and villages nothing remained but ruins. 350,000 homes have been destroyed. To build them up again, I am referring to the building proper, without the furnishings, 600 million days of work will be necessary, involving, together with building material, an outlay of 10 billion francs. As regards personal property of every description either destroyed by battle or stolen by the Germans, there stands an additional loss of at least 4 billion francs. This valuation of lost personal property does not include, as definite figures are lacking as yet, the countless war contributions and fines by the enemy, amounting also to billions. I need hardly say that, in those wealthy lands, practically no agricultural resources are left. The losses in horses and in cattle, bovine and ovine species, hogs, goats, amount to 1,510,000 head, in agricultural equipment to 454,000 machines or carts, the two items worth together 6 billion francs. Now as regards to industries, the disaster is even more complete. These districts occupied by the Germans and whose machinery has been methodically destroyed or taken away by the enemy were, industrially speaking, the very heart of France. They were the very backbone of our production, as shown in the following startling figures. In 1913 the wool output of our invaded regions amounted to 94% of the total. French production and corresponding figures were, for flax from the spinning mills, 90%, iron ore, 90%, pig iron, 83%, steel, 70%, sugar, 70%, cotton, 60%, coal, 55%, electric power, 45%. Of all that, plants, machinery, mines, nothing is left. Everything has been carried away or destroyed by the enemy. So complete is the destruction that, in the case of our great coal mines in the north, 2 years of work will be needed before a single ton of coal can be extracted, and 10 years before the output is brought back to the figures of 1913. All that must be rebuilt, and to carry out that kind of reconstruction only, there will be a need of over 2,000,000 tons of pig iron, nearly 4,000,000 tons of steel, not to mention the replenishing of stocks and of raw materials which must of necessity be supplied to the plants during the first year of resumed activity. If we take into account these different items we reach as regards industrial needs a total of 25,000,000,000 francs. To resurrect these regions, to reconstruct these factories, raw materials are not now sufficient. We need means of transportation. Now the enemy has destroyed our railroad tracks, our railroad equipment, and our rolling stock, which in the first month of the war, in 1914, was reduced by 50,000 cars, has undergone the wear and tear of 50 months of war. Our merchant fleet, on the other hand, has lost more than 1,000,000 tons through submarine warfare. Our shipyards during the last 4 years have not built any ships, for they have produced for us and for our allies cannon, ammunition, and tanks. Here, again, for this item alone of means of transportation, we must figure on an expense of 2,500,000,000 francs. This makes, if I sum up these different items, a need of raw materials which represent in cost at the present rate of prices in France not less than 50,000,000,000 francs. And this formidable figure, gentlemen, does not cover everything. I have not taken into account the loss represented for the future production of France by the transformation of so many factories which for 4 years were exclusively devoted to war munitions. I have not taken into account foreign markets lost to us as a result of the destruction of 1/4 of our productive capital and the almost total collapse of our trade. I have not taken into account the economic weakening that we will suffer tomorrow owing to that loss to which I referred a while ago of 2,500,000 young and vigorous men. This was one of the great byproducts of the war. Thousands of young Americans, vigorous evangels of democratic thought, remained in Europe to bring American ideals and American force into the affairs of the Old World. Those who returned were formidable factors in reshaping the affairs of the nation. Grave injustices were done in some instances to young men who had volunteered in the early days of the war through patriotic motives and who returned to find their places in industry taken by others. In the main, however, the process of absorption went forth steadily and without serious incident. One factor making for satisfactory adjustment was the insurance system put into effect by the United States Government affecting its war forces. Immediately following the armistice, the following announcement was made: Preparations by the government for reinsuring the lives of soldiers and sailors on their return have been hastened by the signing of the armistice. Although regulations have not yet been fully drafted, it is certain that each of the 4,250,000 men in the military or naval service now holding voluntary government insurance will be permitted within 5 years after peace is declared to convert it without further medical examination into ordinary life, 20-pay life, endowment maturing at the age of 62, or other prescribed forms of insurance. This insurance will be arranged by the government, not by private companies, and the cost is expected to be at least 1/4 less than similar forms offered by private agencies. The low cost will result from the fact that the government will pay all overhead administration expenses, which, for private companies, amount to about 17% of premium receipts, will save the usual solicitation fees and, in addition, bear the risk resulting from the wounding or weakening of men while in the service. Private companies would not write insurance on many wounded men, or their rates would be unusually high. The government will arrange to collect premiums monthly, if men wish to pay that way, or for longer periods in advance. This may be done through post offices. The minimum amount of insurance to be issued probably will be $1,000, and the maximum $10,000, with any amount between these sums in multiples of $500. There will be provision for payments in case of disability as well as death, according to the tentative plan. Thus will be created out of the government's emergency war insurance bureau the greatest life insurance institution in the world for peace times, with more policy holders and greater aggregate risks than a half dozen of the world's biggest private companies combined. Out of the experience gained may eventually develop expansion of the government insurance to old age, industrial, and other forms of insurance, in the opinion of officials who have studied the subject. Regulations for reinsuring returning soldiers and sailors are to be framed by an advisory board to the military and naval section of the War Risk Bureau, consisting of Arthur Hunter, actuary of the New York Life Insurance Company, W. A. Fraser, Omaha, of the Woodmen of the World, and F. Robertson Jones, of the Workmen's Compensation Publicity Bureau, New York. Plans are also under consideration for allowing beneficiaries of men who have died or been killed in the service to choose between taking monthly payments over a period of 20 years or to commute those payments into a lump sum. Chapter 55.